Fun time, sun time, the appendix to chapter 13, Schools of Thought. So we start modern economics with Adam Smith, and if you haven't figured that out from everything else that's happened in class, then you haven't been paying attention. We'll talk at some point about people before Adam Smith, but Adam Smith is all about the free market. And not because the free market is beneficial to some people, but because in Adam Smith's mind, the free market is beneficial to everyone. And in effect, he's talking about a society that he lives in where there's an elite, and that those elite really are evil. They're not working for the best interests of everyone, and the market is an equalizer that will make everybody better off. Okay, so he says, all for ourselves and nothing for other people seems in every age of the world to have been the vile maxim of the masters of mankind. He wants to get away from that, right? And the market to him is the way to do that. The market, the competitive market, is the way to fix things. So he also says the real price of everything is the toil and trouble of acquiring it. He's into this real value. It doesn't matter what the price is, right? It doesn't matter what your wage is. It's the real value. How many minutes, how many hours did you have to work to acquire that loaf of bread? That's what matters in Adam Smith's world. Real things. Nominal things don't matter. The price of bread doesn't matter. How many minutes, seconds, hours, years, whatever it is you have to work to acquire that loaf of bread, that's what matters. The real thing. That loaf of bread is real. The money you paid is nominal. It's not real. Okay? Now, remember that he's all about competitive markets. His theory, he doesn't say that his theory works when there's a monopoly or something like that. It's this competitive market that drives his system. And out of the classical world, we get this phrase, laissez-faire. Now, obviously, this is a Monty Python movie, and there was one French guy in the middle of all these British guys. But laissez-faire means let it be. It means hands off. The idea is that we are all better off with less government, with the government staying out of things. So when the financial crisis hits in 2007, 2008, Paul Ryan is the Speaker of the House, and he stands up and he says, we shouldn't be bailing out banks. We shouldn't be giving money to people. We shouldn't do anything. The government shouldn't do anything. The discipline of the market was the phrase he used over and over again. We should let the discipline of the market resolve the issue. And maybe the crash is bigger, but it's shorter, and coming out of that recovery is better. Now, there's no way for us to actually know that, so it's a good argument, and it's a good thing to talk about in class. But clearly, the folks like Paul Ryan are in the Adam Smith tradition. They're classical economists. Okay? This guy is a guy named Alfred Marshall. And what happens in the late 1800s and into the 1900s is classical economics morphs into something called neoclassical economics. Alfred Marshall. And what that is what we call the marginal revolution. So Adam Smith talked about total, right? He was the total of things. Modern economists, starting in the late 1800s with the neoclassicals, realized that what mattered isn't the total of things, it's the marginal, it's the change. And there's hints of this in Adam Smith. But it's this guy, Alfred Marshall, and another guy named William Stanley Jevons, and another guy named Carl Menger, and there's this Leon Walras guy in this, and there's all kinds of other guys. But Alfred Marshall's the guy who writes the book, puts a supply and demand curve in a textbook, marginal benefits and marginal costs, and one more of this and one less of that. And that's what matters, and that's how we make good decisions. So neoclassical economics means we're doing marginal stuff. And I don't mean marginal in a bad sense. Marginal benefit and marginal cost. Okay, so it's another version of classical economics. Alfred Marshall said, every short statement about economics is wrong, with the possible exception of this one. It's one of my all-time favorite economist sayings. And the trick here, we're going to trail classical economics straight up to the present, but understand that the neoclassicals dominate the world. First, the classicals dominate the world, and the neoclassicals dominate the world. Karl Marx is just a classical economist, right? He just is. His theory, where he takes the theory, is a little different than where everybody else takes the theory, but it's Adam Smith, okay? It's his theory. There's not a whole lot of new theory in his theory. There's some different conclusions about what things mean, but Karl Marx is a classical economist, okay? The neoclassicals, again, until we get to the Great Depression, everybody's a classical economist, or more or less. There's a few, and we'll actually talk about one, but mostly everybody, okay? It's a theory that says, today we have this macroeconomics and microeconomics. They didn't believe in that. They just believed in economics. And in fact, they tended to call it political economy because they included some things inside of economics that we would think of as political science. Okay? But they just believe that if all the markets are in equilibrium, that outcome has to be good and society has to be right. So when you get into modern economics, we have these things called dynamic stochastic general equilibrium models, and don't go there, DSGs. But that idea that somehow this whole economy is made up of all these markets and there's a general equilibrium of all the pieces, okay, that's classical economics, right? If every market's in equilibrium, everything must be fine. And what we're going to see is people break from that. But that's why you don't have separate macro and micro in classical, is that they believe that every market in equilibrium means the whole economy is fine. It's the best possible outcome, okay? We look at the individual markets. If individual markets are free and take care of themselves, then we're not going to have a big problem, a societal problem, all right? Hopefully we get that. So classical economics is going to fall apart. You have the Great Depression. Wages and prices fall by a third, and yet we don't get back to equilibrium. Or if we get to an equilibrium, it's a really horrible equilibrium. If at the bottom of the Great Depression we're at equilibrium, equilibrium is not a good thing, okay? People who held on to classical economics with their last dying breath in the 1930s argued that wages and prices just needed to fall more. So they'd already fallen by a third. The average worker who still had a job in the United States had lost a third of their income. And yet, the classical economists were arguing the way to fix the economy is for everybody to have even lower wages. Okay? Pretty much classical economics as a macroeconomic thing is going to blow up for a couple of decades here. And you're not going to have any serious macroeconomists who are this. And this other theory, the Keynesian theory, is going to take over, and we'll talk about that in a second. But for a couple decades, the dominant theory is not this theory. In fact, we get to the point in the late 60s where President Nixon is asked, what's his economic theory? And he looks at the reporter kind of funny and says, aren't we all Keynesians? So, yeah. The revival of classical economics starts in the 50s, doesn't really hit big time until the 60s. And in the 60s and 70s, the big deal is this fight of what's called monetarism against these Keynesians. Okay, and we'll get to them in a second. But monetarism is Milton Friedman. We already talked about him and his theory. He takes us back to this idea that the real stuff matters, nominal doesn't. Keynesians don't believe that. Monetarists believe that the real stuff matters. Your value of your wage doesn't matter. It's the purchasing power of that matters. Okay? And so Uncle Milty rebuilds classical economics through this quantity theory of money, and we already talked about that and what it means, but that's a rebuilding of classical economics. Okay? It's a revival of classical economics. Milton today, a lot of the stuff he did about money and the stuff, most of that we've kind of thrown out. And there's a variety of reasons. Some of it is statistical problems that with what he did, we wouldn't do the stats that way anymore because we know that they don't really show anything. And there's other stuff in what he did. There are still pieces of his theory around, and we've already done some of them, like the difference between SRAS and LRAS. He didn't draw that graph, but really, he's the one that pushed us in that direction of having those two separate curves with the right. So there's Uncle Milty parts here, and he was the sixth winner of the Nobel Prize in economics, right? But what people really remember him for in the modern world is he wrote books about why we should believe in capitalism. So he wrote books like Capitalism and Freedom that are still widely read. They're still bestsellers on Amazon. And it's his talk about why capitalism is better than the alternatives that keeps Uncle Milty popular today. And again, I didn't think too much of him as a human being. But that's just me. Okay, so the monetarists and the Keynesians are going to yell at each other. And they're going to yell at each other for 20 years, and in the end, they're both going to go away. The monetarists are going to fail to convince people that their theory is the right theory, and the Keynesians are going to fail because the 70s, nobody in their right mind can explain the 70s, right? From bell bottoms to disco to, urban cowboy, nobody can explain the 70s. But in general, the Keynesians can't explain what happened in the 70s. The monetarists can't deal with what happened in the 70s. And both of those theories kind of break. Now, there's pieces of them. Again, we get this synthesis, right? We live in this world of synthesis, and we'll talk about that again, where we're taking multiple pieces from multiple theories and putting them all together. So just keep in mind that each one of these theories that we're talking about, there's still pieces of it alive, at least pieces of it alive in our modern economic theories. Okay, so one of the big deals that happens in the 70s and into the 80s that your book hardly talks about is what's called supply-side economics. That dude over there is a guy named Art Laffer. If you're tired of British guys, even though Milton Friedman's from Chicago, he's not a British guy. Art Laffer's from California. He's a USC. To this day, he's still a USC professor. So the first guy we've seen who's still alive, yes? Him. Anyway, he came and spoke at UNLV once, and I spent an evening in a bar with him. So I've listened to him speak, and I've sat in a bar and talked with him. So I know, that's very exciting to you all. The trick to supply-side economics, Art Laffer, that's the guy's name. And there's something called the Laffer curve, which is on that picture behind him, but really people consider it more of a joke than an actual theory nowadays. But there's pieces of it, again, pieces of this that are still alive. So what Laffer says is there isn't an economy. People talk about, well, the economy is good, the economy is bad, this is the greatest economy of all time. To say those phrases it's just nonsense. Those phrases are nonsensical. There isn't an economy. There are 330 million consumers. There are 30 million businesses. There are 150 million workers. Each one of those consumers, businesses, and workers are responding to incentives in the system. And if you really want to figure out what's going on in the world, you have to look at how these individuals are affected by the incentives that are created for them. Okay? Which is, again, sort of Adam Smithy, but much more technical. One of our faculty here at UNLV, he used to work for Laffer, and he says that Laffer's the smartest person he knows. Okay? And he knows me, so Laffer must be really smart. Anyway, we have to look at the little pieces. Okay? We have to look at all the little inside parts of everything. Okay? Out of this theory, to this day, this idea that tax cuts for the rich are the best way to deal with the economy. So Laffer was Ronald Reagan's first economic advisor person before even Ronald Reagan became president. Ronald Reagan did a tax cut that was designed for rich people. George W. Bush did a tax cut that was designed for rich people. Mitt Romney promised to do a tax cut that was designed for rich people if he was elected. Donald Trump did a tax cut for rich people. Every Republican president or presidential candidate, except for John McCain, every single one of them, and except for H.W. Bush. Sorry, forgot that. H.W. Bush and John McCain. Take those two guys out. Everybody else who's either been the Republican president or candidate for president under the Republicans has said, I will put in another tax cut for the rich if I'm elected. And that's a laugher legacy. They don't say his name. Trump is the first president to say his name. Trump actually gave him the Presidential Medal of Freedom. Because Trump's economic advisors are Laffer students. So Reagan had Laffer as his advisor. Trump has Laffer students as his advisors. Okay? And the real movement toward deregulation and just less government in general, that's associated with this theory. Ronald Reagan, in his first inaugural address, said, in this present crisis, government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem. Okay? So supply-side economics is not going to solve our problems. It's clear that the supply-side tax cuts in the 80s created these massive budget deficits. Reagan almost triples the national debt while he's president. And so this is not a theory. And the theory gets co-opted by the far right politically. Laffer voted for Bill Clinton, and John Kennedy's his favorite president. So he's not exactly way out on the far right. But he's way more popular with the far right because his theory is associated with them in many ways. And of course, he's a believer in tax cuts for the rich, which doesn't make him popular with anybody who's not rich.